Welcome to Startup Health Now, the weekly webcast that celebrates the changemakers and healthcare transformers reimagining healthcare. My name is Unity Stoakes, and we have an amazing discussion planned today with Manice. Melissa is an inspiring entrepreneur. She's a PhD, an MPH, and a clinical researcher, a super mom, and the CEO and co-founder of Cohero Health, and also proud to say, a healthcare transformer in Startup Health. Today we're going to be digging into Melissa's superpowers, what it's like really to transition from clinical research to being a digital health entrepreneur, and we'll also dig into mobile health and predictive analytics. Stick around, it's going to be a great show.
It is the duty of leaders to lead, of the creative to create, of the daring to do. The free world expects leadership of us. Its fate and our fate depends upon our leadership. We are industrious, inventive, restless, with the fires that burn within us. But I say that nothing is easy, and the best things are the hardest. And all our troubles, all our immense difficulties, now and in the future, can I say be solved if we have the will, the courage. The future is to those who take it.
Welcome back. Today we're here with Melissa Manice. Thank you for being here. Melissa is the CEO and co-founder of Cohero Health. And just to kick things off, tell us all things you and Cohero Health. What's the mission of Cohero Health?
Sure. Well, simply put, we'll start with where Cohero Health started and really the name really speaks a bit to the mission. So Cohero in Latin means to adhere and to stick together. So as a company, we seek to be really narrow but deep. So narrow in that we really address the needs of the 50 million Americans with asthma and COPD, and deep in that we really address the pain points for patients and then their providers and stakeholders. And so as a company, we really seek to drive improved outcomes and improved care for those patients, so patients with pulmonary disease. So
do you call it a mobile health platform, or how do you describe it when you're talking about it in the industry?
Sure. So that's actually, I would say, it's an interesting question because we have both hardware, so an FDA cleared device, a class 1 device that's our compliance tool. But then we also have an actual class 2 medical device that's a spirometer that captures lung function. So we have the actual front end hardware, but it's powered by our own software. And that software is a mobile app, as well as a HIPAA compliant server and our back end analytics platform. And so, so in a way, we really are the fully integrated platform that really bundles both the hardware and the software. So we do call it a mobile health platform because that's in many ways what we are, the software and the hardware.
So how does it work? How does either a patient use it, or how is the market using the platform?
Sure. So, so the way in which it's utilized is it's really intended to be this robust, patient-centered, remote patient monitoring tool. So in that way, you have an inhaler sensor that has a universal form factor for all the different shapes and sizes of their daily medication. That hooks on. It has a Bluetooth-enabled sensor that connects to our mobile app. In addition, we have a mobile spirometer that captures lung function. And lung function is something that is utilized both at the point of care and is actual per clinical guidelines is what a patient is supposed to utilize in the home. So we take that data, so real meaningful clinical metrics called FEV1 and FVC that capture lung function, capture that on our mobile app, engage, track, remind in real time on actual use, both medication use and then also tracking lung function. And then on the back end, we have our own HIPAA compliant server and then our own API that plugs into a variety of clinical workflows. Because the real end goal is actually that a provider at the point of care is using that data to make treatment decisions.
Because now there's people just using inhalers. There's no data that really goes along with it.
Right. So what we really where this company really originated is that we know in it's a concept called refractory disease, or a refractive patient is a patient where we're basically trying to identify whether they're non-compliant, so not taking their medications as prescribed, or not benefiting therapeutically from the drug. And so that's really a key decision tree that a provider is trying to make if a patient has been to the emergency room or has been hospitalized or having poor outcomes or bad sort of adverse events. And so what we really are trying to do is take away a lot of the guesswork by providing real biometric data. So not just self-reported, surveys or screening tools, but rather actual real-time data on lung function and adherence. And the end goal is that it's something that a patient can use in their daily lives. Is incredibly the actual form factor we've given a lot of thought to be something that is truly mobile, both on the software mobile app side, but also the hardware. But ultimately, we would love to put it in the hands of providers who are utilizing that data to make treatment decisions and so forth.
So just to dig into a little bit of the backstory, what was the inspiration? Was there an aha moment where you saw something in your clinical research or your previous life that gave you the idea to start Cohero Health?
So it was sort of a confluence of events. So my career is in clinical medicine, but was writing my dissertation was really looking at actual sort of barriers to compliance. And Mount Sinai, where I got my PhD, a lot of investigators had done actually pretty impressive work in doing very rudimentary programs for anything from transplant recipients who actually, interestingly, also often sometimes have issues with compliance to their regimen for anti-rejection drugs. So once they've received the transplant, they receive drugs to keep their bodies from rejecting the new organ. And in fact, that's another patient population that had poor compliance. And even a basic text messaging program was incredibly effective long-term at reminding them to take it. So getting them in.
So did you find that in the data somewhere?
So there's really sort of well documented that there are sort of interesting models of sort of sustained behavior change that can really drive improved compliance and sort of and again, sustained better outcomes. So in my case, in the world of pulmonary disease, where I focused my career, I sort of, this whole Cohero Health really came from this realization that I could spend the rest of my life studying the problem. So, or really scale a meaningful solution. So we know there are sort of well documented in disparate places that an intervention like that really worked on a very small patient population, but again, really prospectively, so over the long term. And so why not have a tool that in this case has software, but then hardware that can be really scaled beyond the traditional, N of 100 patients for a 6-month period. And something that I struggled with some of the interventions that I had built and deployed over time was that you, at the end of it, if they had benefited tremendously from an intervention like this, is you sort of at the close of the funding period, it's been nice knowing you. I'm glad you benefited.
And
then it goes nowhere. And so for me, this really felt like a tremendous opportunity to grow something that has the ability to benefit a patient, beyond the scope of
so what's it
funding
been
cycle.
Like to go from clinical researcher and where you're studying something to then now you're building the solution and you're an entrepreneur and you're the leading of this digital health company. What's that transition like, and what's it like to now be an entrepreneur?
It has been an absolute, for me, in terms of I will say it's where my strengths lie in my personality type. I think it's a phenomenal fit. Maybe it's not for everyone, but I have found it to be tremendously inspiring. I will say that in research, there are many days that are not the same, but in many ways there is sort of a great sort of system of building and deploying and then obtaining funding. In this case, for example, we, with Cohero Health on a day-to-day basis, it is, no 2 days really are the same, right? So you're constantly sort of juggling fundraising, So to me, I feel like it's just these sort of constant world of multitasking, which I happen to love, but it really is when you're really trying to scale a technology and commercialize something, there really are different sort of milestones that you're really trying to meet, not just fundraising, but in our case, the regulatory implications,
Right.
constant sort of IP measures, relationships with your developers and your industrial designers and so forth that have been, for me, I feel like I had the foundation, and I feel like we've really tried to always stay close to the sort of clinical need, and that's something that I love that's where this started. But a lot of the other elements of sort of my day-to-day life have really been kind of, I say, sort of building the plane as it's taking off. So sort of learning and sort of really truly learning as it's
Has that been the biggest
accelerating.
challenge, or what have the biggest challenges been as an entrepreneur so far? Is it that constant where you're building something while it's taking off? I mean, what's really...
So one of the old adages, it's funny, someone told me, a PI way back in the day, in this sort of non-dilutive funding world or grant-funded world, is that sometimes it takes a very different person to do the grant than to get the grant. And so in this context, I think something that has been new for me is that I see myself as really the operational CEO that loves really driving the ball forward and really building product, constantly clinically validating, and so forth, and doing all these phenomenal pilot partnerships and so forth, and understand the regulatory and IP. But the fundraising for me has been the newest part, is really knowing how to really encapsulate all that we're doing. It's just a different...
Is it a different type of fundraising? So the grant world...
Yeah, it's very different.
Versus fundraising for your startup. How is it different?
I would say the best way to describe it is, the NIH is changing, but it used to be, basically draft out your idea in 45 pages, right? In the case of an investor, it's pitch your idea in 4 minutes. So it's a whole...
And show me your product, and show me the traction.
And show me your traction. And it's... So while it seems really simplistic of sort of, what's your business model? How do you make money? Who pays? Et cetera, right? Those sort of constant things that everyone comes back to. The reality is that when you're someone who really feels passionately about the pain points that it's solving, the actual product itself, what do you do in my case? You spend, 3 of the 4 minutes describing the solution, and so it's just a really, I feel like that for me has been one of the biggest learning lessons and challenges as I'm sort of a novice entrepreneur.
What advice would you share maybe with other clinical researchers who are thinking of becoming an entrepreneur, knowing what you know now?
Yeah.
So sort of tell your previous self, maybe some words of wisdom.
I think, to be honest, seek out networks truly, and this is not just a plug for Startup Health, but really seek out programs like Startup Health, because in a way, I've sort of seen it as this incredible, not just an accelerator, but this incredible sort of boot camp in how to grow your business. When you're someone who doesn't have, is not a serial entrepreneur per se. So I think that for clinicians and so forth who have phenomenal ideas that they're trying to grow, I know that academic institutions are trying to work really hard to help incubate internally, but don't be afraid to go outside and find these phenomenal networks, whether in New York City, it's in really burgeoning landscape, and so there's a lot of infrastructure that's sort of building that can help you kind of learn those other sort of key components.
It's so lonely to be an entrepreneur on your own, and I think just being surrounded by other people going through that journey at the same time is just incredibly valuable. So
I find that for me, the proximity to creativity is really the thing that keeps me inspired and energized and so forth. And so that creativity might be someone on your team who's, for example, this incredible UX designer who's leading product, and every day you feel like once a week you whiteboard to make sure that you're really iterating in the best way possible. But it also might mean, in the case of, say, for example, Startup Health, quarterly summits with other entrepreneurs who are solving different problems. But again, there are just really sort of common lessons and common people that I think we all really can, are really sort of in many ways are sort of trying to address in many ways the same thing.
So how big's the Cohero team now?
Oh gosh, good question. How do you tally? So I'd say core sitting in our office is 6 people, and then have a incredible team of engineers and developers who are remote, and so your total gets to be, it's amazing how quickly it grows, but probably hovering around under 20, just shy of 20 total that are industrial designers, engineers, developers, because we have hardware and software. There are a lot of components, but we've been able to kind of stay lean as a core team and really capitalize on we have a tremendous FDA consultant, for example, and I think that's part of, and the learning lesson is, when you're really small and kind of in a way bootstrapping, you don't need a full-time regulatory person, and you can still submit a 510K, right? So we submitted our 510K in January with the help of a tremendous FDA consultant whose entire background is in respiratory, right? So it's finding those kind of people, and that's where having a network really matters, because when you can ping 50 people and say, who have you used? Who have you found to be tremendous as a designer when you were doing your rebrand, or when you're, those kind of things are really, really help.
How hard has it been to build hardware and software at the same time? I mean, it's hard enough to do one or the other, so I think that's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, so I think it's to be running them completely in parallel is definitely a day-to-day challenge. But what we in many ways did is we sort of, when you're building kind of a minimally viable product, in some ways, your hardware has to be farther along than your software to deploy that MVP. And so it is a challenge. It's also knowing when you can kind of hit the go button to do real patient testing. And so they've always been running in parallel, and I think making sure those teams work really well together is important, and having someone who is really keen on overseeing and is really good at more than anything in sort of in managing and seeing the big vision of the product, and then sort of knowing how to drill that down on a day-to-day basis.
So the teams all working together, so the software team,
correct,
the hardware team.
And that means that they've, they're in two separate offices, but it means that one is flown to the other. They're constantly, in the case of Bluetooth, right? If you have firmware that's driving the integration into the software, you of course have to have the engineers building the firmware talking to the developers, and so that communication is constant and open, and so that's even when you sort of think about the resources that others can provide in what seem to be kind of trivial tips sometimes, but in how do you effectively project manage 2 remote teams. There are tremendous tools now.
Do you guys, what sort of tools do you guys use?
So we use, in the case of product management, we use Basecamp as a product management tool, and that means that our product manager here is. We really have felt has been tremendous to have someone in-house who has user experience, design experience, and so forth, who really oversees the wireframing and so forth, and the constant user testing here. But then is via Basecamp able to do a lot electronically, constant. Skype is a huge friend of ours, so we're constantly on Skype. And then in the case of doing full-on quality control, it's actually flying over there to actually do real oversight as we're getting to the point on the hardware side of injection molding, tooling, ramping up manufacturing, and so forth. So
amazing. So shifting gears just a little bit, curious about the future, curious about your predictions. What are you excited about today? There's so much change going on. The market's moving really quickly. I'd imagine when you first started in clinical research, these collaborative tools we were just talking about weren't even available. So different types of companies can form and entrepreneurs can emerge. With all of that said, where's this all going?
Yeah, so thinking an incredible sign of a changing time is in October, CMS implemented 2 new CPT codes for remote patient monitoring. And while that seems like, oh, well, that's just 2 reimbursement codes, it's a big deal, right? It has to be an incredible evidence base that the data generated from telemedicine and so forth is meaningful for a provider, for driving improved outcomes, for cost savings and so forth. And so I think it's a sign that really remote data capture has gotten to a point of robustness that it can really improve efficiency, improve point of care decision making and so forth. And I think when everyone sort of uses the term big data,
right.
I would say we're not there yet. I think that, there are many
there's
people doing incredible big data.
There's data being captured.
Correct.
What's happening?
So that's when I say, when you're sort of the next big, I think it's really harnessing that. And in a way, it's really being a bit open source about a lot of these platforms talking to each other. And so when you think about, predictive analytics and precision medicine, to me, it's so exciting to see that, we sit in the world of biometric data. So in our case, lung function data, being able to see whether a drug whether a patient is benefiting from a drug, in that case, even if they're highly compliant or in some cases poorly compliant. So seeing that data sort of together is phenomenal, but in some cases...
From the clinician's perspective, having access to that? Or from the patient's perspective?
And then from a research perspective, right? In driving improved, in our case, improved drug regimens and so forth, but then from a drug development point of view, but also in being predictive of when a patient is then diagnosed, as an example, that we know if you sort of overlaid that and all of a sudden genomic data, that's where it really gets cool and interesting, right? So all of a sudden you have, biometric data and genomic data coming together and saying, we know that for a patient with this genomic profile, that they might benefit from, or they would have the best outcomes possible from being on X regimen.
Who do you think will be linking all this data? Is it an Apple that just came out with their research kit? Or is it Google? Is it Mount Sinai?
Could
be Cohero Health.
Cohero Health, so we, see ourselves as just a small player in that, in the way of being sort of narrow but deep, that we say, well, for pulmonary patients, we are capturing some really meaningful data, but we can't be the end necessarily repository for where it all comes together. And so when you think about who is that best candidate, I wouldn't say that we've bet on one horse in particular, but I do think that while it might seem surprising that it's an Apple, it could very well be. So in our case, for example, Apple contacted us as they were preparing for HealthKit and built basically a repository, essentially HealthKit being sort of a repository of all of these different vitals captured from wearables and so forth, sensor devices. And they built respiratory tracking in there, and they didn't have any, they built it, they basically did incredible market research to see that FEV1 and FVC, these 2 metrics, are really meaningful for respiratory tracking, both for providers and other stakeholders and so forth, but they didn't have any connected devices ready to do it. So for us, it was a tremendous integration opportunity, sort of first mover advantage, because we were at a point of readiness.
So are you integrating with them?
Exactly. So yes, we are. So, and with that, I think that, that Apple, while it might not seem like the most obvious, it is tremendous because they really do have the ability to capture all that front end, data capture, and then their end goal is to be the plug-in to an Epic and so forth. Right. So in our case, we built our own API so that it allows for this kind of data integration opportunity. So now your data
will go straight into Epic,
right? But via a health kit, right?
Sure.
And so
it takes that friction out of the system.
I think so. Rather than us having to solve that integration into all these workflows. So
imagine that across entrepreneurs and developers and researchers everywhere. It seems like we're about to enter a whole new
and I think
cycle of where the innovation can go.
And I think that when you sort of say, well, if I were to tell a customer or an investor a patient or provider, oh, well, we're able to plug into a variety of clinical workflows. Behind that is an Apple, or behind that is a Validic in our case, right? Doing the sort of, in many ways, the middleman behind all that. So I do think that those players are really key agents to this world of kind of really getting to a point of having, both secure data, right? So like patient secure data, but then, and really being thoughtful around that, but also data that can really be integrating from all these kind of, disparate sources.
I gotta say, I'm excited about the next couple of years. So to finish off, I'd like to switch to a lightning round.
Oh, okay.
Some speed questions for you.
Okay.
To learn about you and all sorts of fun stuff. So do you have a favorite book that you recommend to other entrepreneurs, or you gift all the time to other people?
It's funny, and maybe this is because I have two very little kids, so I could say that I have tremendous amounts of time to read, Lean Startup and, the habits of highly effective people. But in reality, sometimes to bring you back to sort of what is important. And one of my favorite books is Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. So my 4-year-old absolutely adores it. My 1-year-old is,
and then you get to enjoy it when you're reading it.
You get to enjoy it. You get to be reminded constantly. And so I think in our case, probably on a 3 times a week basis is what he requests for at bedtime. And at the end of it, what is Dr. Seuss really saying? It really, there'll be good times and there'll be hard times, but at the end of the day, it's about persevering. And I think as a startup, that's in a nutshell, that's kind of what it's about, right? So
it's so true.
If you get into this world knowing it'll all be, always a high. Oh, it will be a high. It will be, but it also be some really insane lows.
Every entrepreneur should read that book.
Yeah, it is exactly.
So second question: what would you be doing if you weren't doing what you're doing with Cohero?
Gosh.
Could be anything.
Anything. Oh, man.
Could be an astronaut.
Astronaut. Oh, man. What would I be doing? Good question. What do I love doing?
I see your skiing pictures on Instagram.
Skiing pictures. I love being active. If I could many, times, yeah. So Unity, you busted me. Love traveling and sports. And I think I really always, as much as I think taking a step away sometimes is important from your day-to-day life of growing and running company. And so I think if I could travel all the time with my kids, that would be tremendous. We're at the phase in our life where our kids are so little that it's wherever our car can take us. But someday we'll get to the point where maybe a lot of plane travel will be involved. I was the child of a flight attendant, so maybe that's
yes.
I have it like in me. But but as far as another career, it almost is my second career in a way.
Around the world.
Adventure around the world, I would say.
So what do you do? You sort of alluded to this, but what do you do to stay healthy yourself? You're busy as doing 10 different things, entrepreneur, mother, all sorts of fun stuff, but you're incredibly busy entrepreneur. How do you stay healthy yourself?
And active. So, I was one of our phenomenal medical students recently said to me, she said, well, a trend that's going all around my medical school is to do this Soylent diet because no one has time to eat because they basically drink their calories.
Right.
And I said, oh my gosh, that sounds so terrible. I love to eat. I love healthy food. I really just, maybe I'm a foodie, but in reality, in the morning, it's so busy getting kids out the door or whatever that maybe I am part of that Soylent trend, but I have a phenomenal, I'm like a Shakeology, fanatic. So I have that in the morning, have a phenomenal sort of morning sprint with work. We're really hard in the morning. And then I sneak out, my office is connected to a gym, sneak out at lunch. And then I have an afternoon sprint and it really breaks up the day. So that's my little, sort of weekday habit of
that's great.
And then of sort of staying active is
you find that helps you as an entrepreneur. Yes. Clear your head. It's what I often do, I will confess, is get up to sort of like have all these emails to sort of address, up until lunch,
do it, and then I find it really helps me be incredibly productive in the afternoon and also clear my head and kind of like, sort of end up sitting on the spin bike or in a class sort of thinking through, how
You're
to
more
go
productive.
after the afternoon. But it improves productivity for
the best moments come, right?
Yeah.
So last question, what's your superpower?
Like if I could be a superhero?
Could be anything.
What would it be?
Could be your super entrepreneur power, your super clinician research power, your super mom power.
Oh, gosh.
What are you great at?
What am I good at?
Your secret weapon.
Secret weapon. I really love multitasking. I do better when I'm busy. So
that's why you're a great entrepreneur.
My dad used to say, give it to the person who's busy because they'll get it done. And so I like to think, I think the reality is sometimes as a mom is that, don't always think that you can do it all, but definitely realize that there is time to be a mom, to be a parent, and raise good kids. But also, I would say that for me, I really like to not always be the one who's micromanaging and in control, and recognizing that it takes a village. So it takes a village as a company, it takes a village as a mom, and so I guess that means that I like to delegate.
This is good. Well, thank you so much. This was so inspiring to hear from you. I love what you're building, and it's wonderful having you as a healthcare transformer at Startup Health. Thank you.
Thank you, Unity. This is phenomenal. Thanks so much.
Thanks.